the coin that built an empire. When people think about the fall of Rome, they usually picture barbarian armies breaking through the gates, cities burning, and an empire collapsing in chaos. But that's not how Rome really fell. By the time the invaders arrived, the empire had already been weakening for decades. The real collapse didn't begin on the battlefield. It began with something much smaller. It's money. Because history has taught us one thing over and over again: when people lose trust in a country's currency, they eventually lose trust in the country itself. That's exactly what happened to Rome, and the story feels surprisingly familiar today. To understand why, we have to go back to the coin that helped build one of the greatest empires in history, the denarius. First introduced around 211 BC, it was made from almost pure silver and quickly became one of the most trusted coins in the ancient world. Roman soldiers earned it. Merchants accepted it across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Families saved it for the future. For centuries, the denarius wasn't just a coin. It was a symbol of stability. People trusted it because they trusted Rome. As long as the empire remained powerful, its currency remained valuable. That trust allowed trade to grow, businesses to thrive, and cities to flourish. The Roman economy became one of the strongest the ancient world had ever seen. But no empire grows forever without paying a price. As Rome expanded, so did its expenses. Every new territory meant more soldiers to pay, more roads to build, more forts to maintain, more borders to defend. War was no longer an occasional event. It had become part of everyday life, and wars are expensive. Eventually, the empire found itself spending more than it could collect in taxes. The treasury was under pressure. The government had two choices: raise taxes and risk public anger, or quietly reduce the value of the money itself. They chose the second option. At first, it seemed harmless. The denarius still looked the same. It carried the emperor's portrait. It felt the same in people's hands. But inside, something had changed. Each new coin contained a little less silver than the one before it. No grand announcement, no warning, just a small change that most people barely noticed. But history has a way of exposing small lies, and this one would become one of the most expensive mistakes Rome ever made, because once trust in money begins to disappear, everything built on that trust starts to fall apart. In the next chapter, we'll see how one small change inside a silver coin triggered a chain reaction that even the greatest empire on earth couldn't stop: the first crack. At first, the plan seemed to work. The government could produce more coins without mining more silver. On the surface, nothing had changed. The denarius still looked familiar. People continued using it. Life went on. But beneath that thin layer of silver, the coin was slowly losing its real value. And with every new emperor, the problem grew worse. Under Emperor Augustus, the denarius was about 95% silver. It was a coin people trusted without question. But as military costs increased and political instability spread, emperors began reducing its silver content. A little at a time, enough that most people wouldn't notice right away. By the early 3rd century under Emperor Caracalla, the silver content had fallen to around 50%. A few decades later, during the reign of Gallienus, it had dropped to less than 5%. What had once been a solid silver coin was now mostly bronze, covered with a thin layer of silver to make it look valuable. The appearance stayed the same. The value didn't. Soon, people began to notice. Merchants realized they needed more coins to buy the same goods. Soldiers demanded higher wages because their pay no longer covered everyday expenses. Families watched their savings lose value without spending a single coin. Trust was beginning to disappear, and once trust is gone, money stops working the way it's supposed to. The government believed producing more coins would solve its financial problems. Instead, it created a much bigger one. Prices started rising. Trade became more difficult. People stopped seeing the denarius as a reliable store of value. Some merchants preferred gold. Others returned to bartering goods instead of accepting coins they no longer trusted. The economy wasn't collapsing overnight. It was slowly coming apart, one transaction at a time. The worst part was that Rome couldn't stop. The more prices increased, the more money the government needed. And instead of fixing the problem, it responded the only way it knew how. It made even more debased. Coins. It was a cycle that fed itself. More coins, less value, higher prices, even more coins. A strategy that looked like a solution had become a trap. And Rome was already too deep to turn back. In the next chapter, that trap would pull the entire empire into one of the darkest periods in its history, when money lost its meaning. By the middle of the 3rd century, the damage could no longer be ignored. The denarius had lost the trust it once held. And when money loses trust, an economy begins to fall apart. Prices kept rising. A loaf of bread that once cost a single coin now required several. The same was true for grain, clothing, tools, and everyday necessities. For ordinary Romans, life became harder with each passing year. Soldiers demanded higher pay just to keep up with the rising cost of living. Merchants became reluctant to accept the new coins, knowing they would be worth even less tomorrow. Many preferred gold. Others returned to bartering goods directly. When people trust wheat more than money, you know something is deeply wrong. Trade began to slow. Local markets struggled. Businesses closed. Farmers abandoned their land because the taxes they owed were no longer worth the effort. The government tried to collect more revenue, but the economy it depended on was already breaking apart. Then came the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome was hit from every direction. Civil wars erupted, foreign invasions intensified, deadly plagues spread across the empire. Emperors came and went at an astonishing pace, with many ruling for only a few months before being overthrown or assassinated. Political chaos filled the headlines of the day. But underneath it all was an economy that had lost its foundation. The empire wasn't just fighting enemies at its borders, it was fighting a financial crisis from within, and that battle proved even harder to win. In the next chapter, one emperor would attempt a desperate solution, trying to control prices by law. It didn't end the crisis, it made it even worse. The empire's last gamble. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome's economy was on the edge. Inflation had spiraled out of control, trade had slowed, confidence in the currency was almost gone. The empire needed a solution. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian believed he had found one. Instead of fixing the money, he tried to control the prices. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, one of the most ambitious economic laws in Roman history. It set price limits on more than 1,000 goods and services, from food and clothing to wages and transportation. The message was simple. No one was allowed to charge more than the government's approved price. Those who did could face severe punishment, even death. On paper, it sounded like a solution. In reality, it ignored the real problem. The money itself had already lost its value, and no law could change that. Merchants refused to sell their goods at artificially low prices. Many hid their products. Others turned to the black market, where prices reflected reality instead of government orders. Soon, official markets began to empty. The law remained, but the goods disappeared. Diocletian had learned a lesson that governments throughout history would learn again and again. You can control prices, you can threaten people, you can print more money, but you cannot force people to trust a currency that has already lost its value. Eventually, Rome gave up on the denarius altogether. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine the Great introduced a new gold coin called the solidus. Unlike the denarius, it maintained a consistent gold content and quickly restored confidence. The solidus would remain one of the most trusted currencies in the world for centuries, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire. But for the Western Empire, it came too late. The economy had already been hollowed out, trade had weakened, the tax system was failing, and the empire no longer had the financial strength to support the army that had once protected it. The barbarians didn't destroy a healthy empire, they walked into one that had already been weakened from within, and Rome's greatest weakness wasn't just its enemies. It was the loss of trust in its own money. In the next chapter, we'll see why Rome's story didn't end with Rome, and how the exact same pattern has repeated throughout modern history. History keeps repeating. You might think Rome's story belongs to the ancient world. It doesn't. The faces change, the currencies change, but the pattern stays the same. When governments spend more than they can afford, there's always a temptation to weaken the value of money instead of fixing the problem. Rome did it with silver. Modern nations do it with paper. And today, with digital money, one of the clearest examples came after World War I. Germany was drowning in debt and burdened with massive reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. Instead of raising enough revenue, the government printed more money. At first, it seemed manageable. Then prices began to rise. Soon they exploded. By 1923, Germany was in the grip of one of the worst hyperinflation crises in history. A loaf of bread that had once cost a single mark eventually cost billions. Workers were paid several times a day because their wages lost value within hours. Life savings disappeared almost overnight. People carried stacks of cash just to buy basic food. Money still existed, but it had stopped serving its purpose. The same story unfolded decades later in Zimbabwe. Economic decline, falling production, and growing government debt pushed the country into another inflation crisis. The response was familiar: print more money. Instead, the currency collapsed. By 2008, prices were doubling almost every day. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency, and people turned to foreign money just to survive. Different countries, Different centuries, the same mistake. When trust in money disappears, economies begin to break apart. History doesn't repeat itself. Exactly, but it often follows the same script. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If Rome, Germany, and Zimbabwe all believed they could outsmart economics, are modern nations really so different? In the final chapter, we'll look at today's financial system and why Rome's greatest lesson may be more relevant now than ever before. Rome's warning for the modern world. So, what does Rome's story mean for us today? The world is very different. We don't carry silver coins in our pockets. Most money exists as numbers on a screen. But one thing hasn't changed. Money still depends on trust. Today, every major economy runs on fiat currency, money that isn't backed by gold or silver but by confidence in the government that issues it. As long as that confidence remains, the system works. But when trust begins to fade, history suggests the consequences can be severe. Over the past few decades, governments around the world have accumulated record levels of debt. During financial crises, recessions, and the pandemic, central banks created trillions of dollars to support their economies. These actions helped prevent deeper economic damage, but they also reignited debates about inflation, purchasing power, and the long-term value of money. Most people don't notice these changes overnight. The bills look the same. Your bank balance may even grow. But if prices rise faster than your income, your money quietly buys less than it used to. That's why inflation is often called the silent tax. Not because money suddenly disappears, but because its purchasing power slowly fades. Rome didn't collapse the day its coins lost silver. It collapsed after years of declining confidence. Trust faded first, then trade weakened, then the economy, and finally, the empire itself. History doesn't say that every country facing inflation is destined to become another Rome, but it does remind us of something important. A strong economy isn't built on printing more money. It's built on productivity, confidence, and responsible decisions. Because once trust is lost, it's incredibly difficult to earn back. Rome learned that lesson 2,000 years ago. The question is, have we? If history teaches us anything, it's this. Empires don't usually fall because of one catastrophic event. They fall because small mistakes are repeated for too long. And sometimes, the first sign of decline isn't at the border. It's in the money people carry every day. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to subscribe. Because the past doesn't just tell us where we've been. Sometimes, it quietly warns us about where we're going next.